Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dark Rhino Security Confidential. Today we have another fantastic guest, Kevin Tambascio. I hope I didn't pronounce that incorrectly, Kevin, but Kevin's a fantastic guy, and he's from my hometown back in Ohio, so he gets extra points for that. But regardless, he's currently the director of cybersecurity, data, and application protection for Cleveland Clinic. He's worked at great companies like Rockwell. He has over 2 decades of experience in software development and in cybersecurity, and he has a couple patents to his name to add to the credentials here. And also, Kevin, I believe you're the president-elect of the HIMSS Chapter in Northern Ohio. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And when he has spare time, and I don't know when he does, but when he does, he likes to get involved with charities, and he's working with Velosano in raising funds for cancer research. Thank you, Kevin, for being here and joining the show.
Thanks, Manoj. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I mean, that's quite a resume you got there. I got to tell you. I mean, there's a lot of questions. I don't know how many we're going to be able to get through today, but I can tell you that everyone listening is going to have a keen interest, because there's not one of us that unfortunately is not going to get sick and at some point is going to need healthcare. Right? It's just a fact of life. It's part of being human. So, and unfortunately, healthcare has been in the news a lot. A lot of health systems have been in the news. So, I'm sure you got the audience's attention. But let's start with your work at Rockwell. You look at Rockwell, that's industrial systems, and now you're in healthcare. How those two worlds on the surface seem very different when it comes to cyber. But how did that experience shape your view into healthcare cybersecurity?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I spent over 18 years at Rockwell, starting as a software developer, and then I started to get into cybersecurity kind of well before we had any formal cybersecurity, programs or activities happening there. We started to create internal product cybersecurity governance at some point and started to build secure requirements, pen testing of products, number of different activities aligned to really improve the security of those products before they hit the market. If you're not familiar with Rockwell, they produce products that work in the industrial control systems sector. So many industry verticals like pharmaceutical, water and wastewater treatment, food and beverage production, energy production and distribution.
Yep.
So many different verticals that really are impacted by cybersecurity, and really we worked with them to drive the improvements into the product lines. A lot of people, when I told them, hey, I'm going to the Cleveland Clinic, were really surprised. Like, even I have a family member who works at the clinic, and she was like, why would you come here? Why is this important, right? It really was eye-opening. A lot of similarities, a lot of differences. Similarities, looking at how healthcare, is a critical infrastructure. It is a critical industry, just like power or food, beverage production here in our country. It's lots of legacy systems. In both hospitals and industrial control systems, you have a if it's not broke, don't fix it type mentality. You have large capital systems that are in place, very expensive to rip out and replace. And so the prevailing mentality in many cases is going to be, hey, it's working, let's keep it running, let's not touch it, let's not have that risk of change here in the organization.
So, one question I had, because you are familiar with ICS and DCS systems, and we've had this discussion on the show a couple times. We know that from a threat intelligence perspective, the FSB in Russia and the GRU are actively working on ways of physically causing, shall we say, discrepancies in ICS and DCS systems, right? They're really focused on that for obvious reasons. Have you seen something like that developing in the healthcare space? Do you see nation state actors wanting to look at disrupting, or is it really just criminals right now that are playing that role?
I think it's probably safe to say it's both at different levels. Certainly, a lot of activity we see are more the financially motivated, groups that are out there looking, as you know, the value of healthcare information. I've seen estimates anywhere from 10 to 40 times as expensive on the black market, compared to credit cards and other types of personal information. So there's a credible amount of money that's being made by these groups who are targeting healthcare, trying to target the information due to the value of that information. So I think a lot of the threats we see are also are tied more towards those actors who are more financially motivated. But we have seen evidence of other nation states involved in these as well. We talk a lot as a team about sort of the geopolitical situations and how, the general, when conflicts arise politically, how that can influence all participants in critical infrastructure. So not just healthcare, but other verticals, can also be affected by those types of activities that are believed to be, driven from nation state actors. So I'd say it's tough. It's attribution is always difficult, right?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's not the most difficult thing.
Yeah, but it's safe to say a lot of financial motivation. Certainly, as geopolitical things happen, seeing effects in other industries that likely are coming from nation state actors too.
There was and I haven't followed this case, but it came to my attention. It was the federal lawsuit that I think Merck and FedEx had filed against their insurance carriers for refusing to pay out a claim on their cyber insurance policy. Mm-hmm. And that was a result of an action resulting from the Russians in Ukraine. And this was way back in 2014 when they annexed the Crimea. And they were collateral damage. I mean, both FedEx and Merck had offices there, and that became the conduit by which bad things came into their network. And in the case of Merck, they couldn't supply vaccines for quite some time, as it really disrupted their operations physically.
Right.
And their cyber insurance policy actually didn't cover it. And now it's a lawsuit. I don't know what the final result of the lawsuit mm-hmm. is, but as far as the insurance company was concerned, that was the result of an act of war, and that's not covered.
Yeah. And again, that difficulty to find attribution and definitively say what happened here or who was behind it, right, leads to a lot of that ambiguity, So I think you'll continue to see those kind of situations because how do you definitively prove it was Group A or this nation or what have you? It's very, very difficult to do.
It's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of resources to do it. And certainly I know our law enforcement agencies, unless the case is of a magnitude where they have to get engaged, it's very difficult given the number of cyber attacks occurring on a daily basis. But one thing that comes up with that is that as the business of healthcare, at the executive level, how much of a priority is spend on cybersecurity relative to everything else that budgets have to go towards?
Sure.
Is there a growing awareness there, or are things changing? What are your thoughts, Kevin?
Yeah, I think there certainly is growing awareness. Nobody wants to be in the news for the wrong reasons. I think drives a lot of that awareness. Every time there's a new situation where a healthcare system is impacted, I'm sure there's lots of conversations at other institutions saying, what is it going to take to make this never happen to us? How do we avoid ever being, on the front page of the paper as a result of something like this? I recently read that a group called Cybersecurity Ventures was predicting about a 15% year-over-year increase in cyber spending by healthcare institutions. And it totaled, they said, up to 125 billion over from 2020 to 2025. When I talk to peers at hospitals, certainly a lot of investment is happening. Certainly I think executives are seeing, the impacts. They're seeing, operational downtime. They're seeing recovery costs that can far exceed, the spend that they might have to do from a cybersecurity perspective. Recently read some other stats about, 25% of ransomware hit institutions, experience maybe a month of impact, or it takes a month to fully recover from one of these attacks. 94% said that ransomware affected their ability to deliver care to their patients.
I'm certain of that, yeah.
So, it's important that the executives understand that cybersecurity is patient safety. Just like in the control system world, cybersecurity is a factor in safety in general.
Absolutely.
You look at the safety of those types of systems. And so, it's important for them to really understand that connection, that these two are related. Just like in industrial control systems, healthcare is all about availability. We need to have availability of care. Our institutions don't close. People are in need, 24/7. And so if this can impact availability of care, our ability to deliver care at scale, it matters and it's important. And it's really more of that patient safety issue than a cyber issue in that sense.
And I'm so glad to hear you say that, and I hope the folks who are in the industry that are listening really kind of take that to heart, because we've always seen, and this on our side as a cybersecurity firm, our evidence is anecdotal. Our survey is basically our customer base, but we always see this tension in healthcare in priority of spend. A new MRI versus a new SIM. I'm just making this up, or investment in a SOC or whatever the case may be. Sometimes the impression, and of course we're biased because we're in cybersecurity, that we get is that these goals are somewhat orthogonal to each other, right? The spend on specific healthcare instrumentation versus spend on, as you put it, patient safety. How can we reconcile that, or how can we help the executives in the industry reconcile that? You gave some great stats, but are there some approaches that have worked for you that you've seen that people can use here?
I think, those two, helping patients or investing in care and investing in cyber, I personally don't view those as mutually exclusive in that sense. Again, I think if you connect it to patient safety, if you go to the executive team and talk about firewalls and endpoint protection and all these great technologies and stuff that we could bring if only you give us the money for them, right?
Yeah.
You're probably not going to go in there and get their support, but if you talk about how this could disrupt care, you talk about the impact of patient safety, you talk about how patients are at their most vulnerable when they're in our care, right? And the last thing we want them to be thinking about is my data safe? Are these devices that are connected to me, are they safe, right? Am I safe, being in this facility? Those are the last things we want them to really be worrying about. So I think you have to have a talented cybersecurity leadership team that can really translate the technical tools and things that we think about as cybersecurity professionals and find a way to show the value in language that they care about. And again, here, in probably every hospital, patient safety, availability of care, protection of information, confidential information, of course, is paramount to how we do. It's paramount to our reputation. It's paramount to the trust that we want to have with our patients. And that trust can be lost instantly, if we don't invest if we don't protect those things. So I think it takes, it's not really a technical discussion at that point. You have to have somebody who has the skills to really understand their concerns and bring that message to them in a way that is going to resonate with them. And hopefully you'll see, successful funding and successful support from the top down once you're able to achieve that.
And you know what? That is a little bit of a critique on our own colleagues in the cybersecurity industry. And I do think they're guilty of this, is that quite often the discussions turn into technology conversations or things that really business leaders are not going to find relatable. And that becomes a failure point then.
Mm-hmm.
As you're describing, that bridge needs to be crossed. It needs to be made. That it's really not about the technology. It's about this. And if we do this, like,
well, I think it's also about maintaining it. Like, I wouldn't, crossing that bridge, but also how do you keep crossing that bridge? So how, we invest a lot into metrics and tracking results, right? And so, because if you go back to the board in 6 months and say, hey, we deployed endpoint protection, right? Okay, great, that's fine, I guess. But if you could say, hey, we've blocked 3 million emails that had malicious attachments, or we've stopped 500 people from clicking on an attachment through our awareness training or something. Wow, okay, I can actually start to see the impacts of that. Had one of those attachments gotten through, one of those attachments been clicked on, we could be in that situation where we're in the news, for the wrong reasons. So I think, connecting it to real outcomes is something that our leadership team takes really seriously. Because again, once you've gotten your initial resources, that's great, but then how do you keep and maintain that support? And I think you have to continue to find ways to measure your progress, not in tools, not in technology, but in real outcomes that you can share back. And I think, to your point, that resonates with the business leaders and the executives, like, hey, I'm getting value from these dollars I'm spending. And it's probably true for every industry, right?
It's true for everyone.
Right. Nothing really is healthcare specific here. You have to find out what that executive team cares about, and how does cybersecurity impact their work? In many organizations and manufacturing, availability of the plant is huge, because downtime costs a lot of money. So how does cybersecurity help you maintain that plant up and running, right? That can be a motivator and help gain support. So it's really about understanding what's important to them and tailoring your message, and then try to find ways to keep measuring your progress in that same language so that you continue to get that support.
Well, so let's talk about some things specific to healthcare. We look at it as a highly regulated environment with a host of regulations that govern the environment, HIPAA being the most obvious. But to the layperson, it seems like even in spite of that regulation, the safety of that data hasn't really come out as a result of it. Is there a disconnect there in perception?
I think it's a great question. I think it comes down to that mindset of security and compliance in some ways. Compliance may be more focused on, what is the minimum set of requirements we need, to earn that certification. And some of these compliance frameworks also, we have to always remember they're very risk-based. And so when they're risk-based, it allows you to potentially document a shortcoming or accept risk of something that's not there in times. I kind of think about one of my other, with Velosano, one of the things I do is I do a lot of road biking. So I get on the road and ride my bike, and there's one house that always makes me kind of think about this question. It's this house that's on a corner. It's got 2 driveways on the corner, and they have a gate across each of the driveways, right? So if the compliance says, hey, we need to have, a gate across, your property. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a gate, right? The problem is there's no fence that connects the gates in any way, right? So you've got a gate, you check a box for compliance, you have a gate, right? you don't have a fence, or maybe you have like guard dogs, or maybe you have some other control, but from the outside looking in, it looks like you're not secure in that sense. So it's kind of reminded of that example as I think about this question. I think there's also a lot of thought too, where compliance frameworks and regulations are great, but the threat landscape just changes so fast.
Yes.
New attacks happening, tactics and techniques are changing so frequently. It's hard to keep up in that case. Some of these compliance frameworks, you're getting assessed every couple of years. And so, how does that environment change in the course of 2 years? I mean, that's 2 years of a lifetime, when it comes, to cybersecurity, as we all know. So I also think, in terms of like why people, are still getting impacted too, a lot of cybersecurity controls, it's hard to stop the people aspect of cybersecurity. It's hard to, stop, insider risk and social engineering and some of the things that are able to get around the protections you have in place in many cases. I think a lot of things kind of lead up to that fact. I think a lot of healthcare institutions are doing a great job at bolstering cybersecurity, and there's no doubt that there is a big role for these regulations, to play. I think there's also a lot of work to, validate the environment and make sure that, controls are working and the controls are producing value and they're defending against the threats that you expect to see there.
Now, is there is this where a role of a purple or red team can come into play to really, you look at regulations, they're kind of based on a rear view looking landscape, right, of what the threats were. But the red/purple teams, that's ingenuity can come into play there potentially. Or what are your thoughts on their role in this ever-changing landscape?
Yeah, so just before I took this job, I was leading our purple team and red team efforts at the Cleveland Clinic here. We built a program to really with the mindset of how do we validate the environment? How do we validate the controls are working? Because this is an incredibly complex institution. And we have, a variety of different controls that really all have to kind of work together to give a picture of health of the organization, a picture of our defenses. So we set out to, take a group of people to, look at some of the most realistic threats that we expect to see in the environment. We came up with a way to kind of stratify the different threat actors based on if we feel they're a direct threat to us or maybe just a direct threat to the healthcare industry. And we would take some time to study what are the tactics and techniques they're using. Are they using malware delivered through email? Are they, trying to directly attack the infrastructure of the victim there? And so we started to kind of come up with a backlog of different scenarios we wanted to try. In some cases, we were using off-the-shelf tools. In some cases, we were developing, some stuff to try to get around our endpoint controls in the same way that a threat actor would do. And we were actually able to test out these scenarios in a safe way. We really used it to try and drive continuous improvement here. So how can we get better as an institution? How can our defenses be improved? What gaps do we have? We were able to make a lot of defensive improvements through that work. And really, a lot of tuning of controls or maybe we, didn't have a feature turned on, or maybe, we needed a better option over here, for something. It led to a lot of really good insights, to help operationalize and practice both the people, the process, and the technology that make up your defensive capabilities. It also helped us answer questions from our leadership. It wasn't uncommon for them to see some news article over the weekend, that said, hey, APT 29 is doing this, right? And they come in Monday morning like, hey, should we be worried about this thing, right? There's a new threat, or do we need to be worried about it? And what we were able to do over time is kind of put our results into MITRE ATT&CK framework and start to be able to characterize like, well, ABT 29 is using these tactics and techniques. We've already tested these techniques. We've actually run real tests against our environment, and here's how we fared. Here's our results. And then be able to show, we have confidence that we can stop this thing, or maybe we have some gaps we need to go fill quickly here. So having that real world validation, that real world data was so helpful and continues to be helpful. Since I've moved on, the program's continuing. But just to have real data about how our tools work and how our people and processes work is really invaluable. So I feel like it's a very, and I've done some past presentations on this too, just the value of like truly validating the environment. It's great to get a cybersecurity control in place, but just bringing it into the organization is really just the first step. How do you operationalize it? How do you build processes around it? How do you make sure information is going to the defensive team? How do we practice the attacks and make sure those tools are detecting the things they should be, or preventing the tools, or preventing the situations? How do we know that the defense team's going to react in the way we want them to react, right? So it definitely provided a framework of how do we bring in controls and really make sure that they're ready for prime time.
See, right there was worth the price of admission to this podcast. I mean, you pretty much laid out the ABCs, the fundamentals, and the value of what you were doing with the red and purple teams in the environment. You're absolutely correct. And it's refreshing to hear that the scenarios are actually undergoing real world testing. So it's not just a check in the box on the control. It's actually a validation that the control has an effectiveness to it. And perhaps more importantly, as you mentioned, the policies that are built around it. And I would imagine that at some point you would have to bring in all the end users into the equation, right? Because a policy without their support really isn't very effective per se, right?
Yeah.
Were there was there an approach you used to get the knowledge out to the broader community, or trying to get that culture of cybersecurity that we want you to do A, B, and C when you're working now? And this is not meant to be a hindrance. It is for everyone's benefit here.
Sure. Yeah, we have a training platform, that we do. We have annual cybersecurity training, just like many different companies do. Certainly, we do regular, testing of our employees with, phishing tests and things, and look for ways to improve and raise awareness of the threats that are there. Just a couple weeks ago, I was at a birthday party my son was at, and it happened to be some of the other people at the table, were nurses at Cleveland Clinic. I mentioned, I work there too, and I work in cybersecurity, and they had asked me about personal, why can't we access personal email like Gmail and stuff like that? And so I started talking about the threats, how attachments could get in and you bypass our controls, and they just had no idea what I was talking about. Like, just the concepts and stuff I was talking about were just so, foreign to them at some level. And so it really kind of highlights the fact that, I like to joke that people in cyber are not normal people in that sense. Like, we're so numb. We see and breathe this stuff every day, right? We see cyber stuff. We see the bad news. We see all the threat actors. But normal people do not see all of this. And so they, you have to work hard to really help them understand that stuff's happening, that we're not making this up. There are real attacks happening and stuff, because normal, quote unquote, normal people don't see this stuff happening. So I think it's really important to connect, as I mentioned earlier, people still being most times the most vulnerable part of an organization. Yes. And just really connect with them and share stories. And have awareness activities in your organization, have a cybersecurity week or something, and you have events to raise awareness and stuff on top of your training and some of those kind of things. And I think kind of like to the executive audience, like what's important to a clinician, right? So again, like, let's not talk to our nurses about firewalls and antivirus stuff, right? But let's talk about, like, ransomware and how it could affect operations, how could it affect patient care, right? Something that they can relate to and do understand and obviously care a lot about. And so, again, making sure that training is approachable, that they can understand it, that they see, we have to share some of these stories, not in the world's burning kind of mode, or we've all seen the presentations of how all the world's burning and everything, right? So, but there is a reasonable approach you can take to kind of share some of that in a way that makes an impact to them. I mean, certainly the nurses I was talking to at the birthday party, they walked away with like, oh, okay, it is important to have complex passwords. It is important to not click on stuff. Right?
So can you share anecdotally a story or two real quick that really resonated with them?
I mean, just talking in general about how these attacks originate. I think, that, you could be sort of innocently just browsing, your email, and you download something and you don't think twice about it, and you might open it up on like a work asset, right? I think there is a thought that, like, the way people get in is from the outside, or some kind of advanced attack or something like that. The idea that somebody could be sort of, inadvertently just kind of almost innocently click on something and it starts a major incident in that sense, I think was the eye-opening part, kind of realizing how easy it is. That this isn't, again, this isn't necessarily hard to carry out some of these things. You're sending malware out through emails, through automated mechanisms, through stolen botnets and stuff. It's not, as we've seen in the industry, there's ransomware groups for hire. There's open source examples or open source toolkits or code that a ransomware organization can buy. The bar has continued to get lower and lower, for managing and issuing these campaigns. And so I think the average person doesn't realize how prevalent this is, how relatively easy it is for them to, unknowingly being a part of, an incident like that.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some things that are not so easy to do. So when we talk about embedded systems, which is something that you're an expert on here, and there's a lot of them, right? And a lot of these systems, when they were not built with security as a prime factor in their relative design points. How big a threat are they, first of all, and how does one go about managing this?
Sure. I think how big of a threat are they? Certainly, we are seeing, impacts to, seeing the attacks that are affecting, these types of devices. From talking to peers and others in the industry, though, a lot of these systems, a lot of operational technology systems like medical devices and control systems and stuff, a lot of times they are talking back to standard IT infrastructure or, standard, servers and things that, just like any other server that might be, sitting in your environment. So, certainly it's important to look at the whole picture and where, you have the most risk, but also recognizing that a lot of times the threats to operational technology systems can be the more IT-centric pieces of that. The servers that are supporting medical devices next to the servers that are supporting email could both be susceptible to ransomware.
Human interfaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in terms of what we do about it, I think, vendors are doing a lot of good things. There's a lot of industry standards that have come about. IEC 62443 in the industrial control space was put together to drive improvements to devices, improvements to system integrators, improvements to operators and how they operate and maintain the cybersecurity quality and safety of a system. You have, Biden's executive order of last year, to start incorporating cybersecurity measures into IoT and medical devices and things. I think the language was anything the federal government buys. Well, it turns out the VA is a really big buyer of medical devices. Yeah. So a lot of those activities are going to also start to really flow into, the medical device space as well. So I think it really is a partnership between vendors and end users like us. Vendors have to do their part. They have to engineer the products with cybersecurity in mind. They need their teams and their processes to account for cybersecurity, like doing secure design reviews and secure, threat modeling and stuff to look at the threats that device or that system is exposed to. And they have to document a lot of things for us. They have to, I view them as enabling us to then kind of take ownership of the cybersecurity. In order to do that, we have to understand the attack surface of these systems. We have to understand the patching requirements. We have to understand, how to set up accounts, securely. How do we connect it securely to our infrastructure? Can we segment the network where that system is into something else? So for us to take ownership and drive security and maintain the level of security, it's really that vendor has to enable us, to be able to do that. But at the same time, we could buy the most secure product in the world, and if we turn on risky features, if we don't, put it into our environment in a secure manner, we've undone all the work that they've done. So it's really a partnership between the product vendors, system integrators, and operators that need to have a role here, and each of us has to enable the next group to take responsibility for security.
Is there a threat from foreign chip manufacturers whose subsystems are getting embedded in these products?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been instances of compromised devices, compromised chips. It's a big problem to look at the authenticity of these components. And these devices are incredibly complex. I mean, the hardware bill of materials for these devices can be hundreds or thousands of individual components.
Oh, I'm sure.
Right? And just being able to account for the security of each of those components, knowing that each of those components probably has its own hardware bill of materials and software bill of materials, becomes an incredibly complex problem to identify and sort of vet every component in a system like that.
What about using open source libraries in these systems? I'm sure. I mean, I've never programmed a infusion pump, but I would imagine that it's got open source components in it. No one's building everything from scratch. Is there inherent risks that are coming out of that arena, or is that not so much?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, any product out there today is, think about the devices and systems that are running embedded Linux, right? Think of
tons of them.
Thousands of open source developers who've had a hand in some component of Linux, right? Speaking of Linux in more general sense, not the kernel, but just, how many people, how many components, and how many things are in there. It's incredibly complex. I think in my experience, sometimes, 20-30% could be code that the vendor's written and they've, built on top of a Linux device or some other type of embedded or real-time operating system. And, you're taking the word of the vendor, or you have to find a way to trust the open source that you're bringing in, because whether it's intentional or not, the customer is going to look at that device as having your name on it. And whether you wrote the code or whether you brought in some open source library, I mean, think about Heartbleed a few years ago, several years ago, maybe.
Sure.
The Open SSL library, right? That's a component. A lot of devices have that component inside their product. Whether you wrote the code or not, you're putting your mark, your brand, your reputation on the device, and it has that. You have that responsibility then. So it's very important that when you're engineering these products and you think about the components coming in, that you have processes and procedures in place to really account for the risk of everything. The code you're writing, the code that your employees are writing, if you're contracting the code out to a third party, are they building the product in a way that's going to represent your standards, right?
Yep.
And then anything you bring in, whether it's commercial, whether it's open source, how do you vet it? How do you, make sure that it's at the level of quality you're looking for? Because ultimately, you're responsible for what happens with that product from a security perspective. Customer doesn't care. They're not gonna say, "Oh, that's just the open source piece." It's like, no, they bought a widget from you. You are responsible for it, and whether it's your fault or not.
So I guess, do our laws need an update, or is there some government policy things that need to come into play here? Because it's impossible to secure everything. It's just not realistic, right?
Sure. I think there's certainly some movement starting to happen there. The executive order, there's a couple other legislative activities that seem to be brewing to, really kind of address concerns, especially in the medical device realm, to ensure that at least, some basic things, can be put into these devices, some basic, I'll call it cybersecurity hygiene that can be put into these things. Every device, no device should have a hard-coded password that you can't change, right? Effectively a backdoor into the device. You should be able to have services off by default and have that attack surface as small as possible. Signed firmware. How do we guarantee the software running in these devices is authentic?
I was going to ask you that question, actually.
I think if you look across different regulations and different, all these different things that are happening, there's certainly a lot of common angles to them, right? Some common principles that we can all agree are good things to have in these devices.
Well, you look at the aircraft, you look at the aviation industry, and even today, from what I hope my data is still accurate, but I know for even a couple of years ago, engine control system software, you could not update online. It was still delivered on disks. Mm-hmm. And that was because of ensuring the authenticity of that code. They knew what was being, versus if it was updated by some cloud server, the OEMs couldn't guarantee that is genuine.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. I think though your attack surface is so big, it's mind-boggling to me, the number of devices, the number of integrations that you folks have. It's just impossible to seal every single thing. There has to be a level of risk that there's no such thing as 100% cybersecurity, I guess. Sure. And maybe where I'm advocating personally for is that there has to be some leeway, because it's just not real to say that we're going to have zero risk.
Sure. Yeah, I think it comes down to really understanding the threats. I know it kind of sounds cliche because everyone says this, right? But it's understanding your threats, understanding your assets, your asset inventory. And both of those are very difficult to kind of wrap your arms around and understand. There's a lot of great resources out there. The Health ISAC, each ISAC organization, can provide information to healthcare organizations around the threats that we, face here. And really that's when you can start to kind of orient your approach, to security here. It's without understanding that, everything feels like a priority. Everything feels like a good thing to do. But you start to get to another level of maturity when you start to realize, like, these are the top three things. Maybe email is our most important. Our everyone in the industry is getting attacked through email. Email is the most important thing we should focus on first. So you can give direction to your teams. You can spend in that way. You have to have some way to provide priorities, or else we all have 15 number one priorities on our plate.
Sure.
You have to have that something that's guiding you, whether it's the threats, if it's more of a general risk approach in that sense, but it's very important to have something that's guiding you there.
Speaking of guiding you, we're coming to the end here. I know we haven't hit all the questions here, but I did want to give you a chance. I know Velosano seems like something they're very important to you. You are engaged with them in fundraising. Tell us a little bit about them, and also please tell us about other things you're involved with and would like our listeners to know about, and we'll put them in the show notes as well if you have links and things that you'd like to share.
Sounds great. Yeah, a couple thoughts there. Velosano is a fundraiser that the Cleveland Clinic puts on. We raise money for our cancer research. To date, over $30 million has been raised for they call them seed grants that really sort of help us do some initial research, which then they can take the results of that initial research and apply for state and federal grants that kind of amplify, the initial investment, the initial grant that we're able to raise for them. We just had our annual bike ride back in September. So to date, over $3 million were raised for this year, and 100% of that money does go to our cancer research at our institution.
Excellent.
It's a great event from a cycling perspective. If you're in the Cleveland area, I definitely recommend checking it out and being a participant here. There's also ways to do virtual fundraising and be able to support members or people who are doing it. Cancer, unfortunately, it affects all of us. Everyone's got a story. I lost my grandfather in 1995.
So sorry to hear that.
And had other friends and family members affected. And so it's unfortunately, and I had team members this year that, had far worse losses, far more impacts due to cancer. So unfortunately, we all have these stories. We all know somebody who was impacted here. And so to me, it's a very personal cause. It's great to give back to my institution and all the great work that our caregivers do in that space.
Fantastic. Now, do you have any talks coming up or any appearances that you're going to be doing?
At this time, I don't have anything planned. I don't have any talks planned at the moment, but have been a past participant of the National HIMSS event that's coming up in April of 2023. It's tough to talk about 2023 already, but here we are. There. Right? And so the National HIMSS event will be in April 2023 in Chicago this year. Last year, I went with one of my team members, and we talked about purple teaming in healthcare, kind of a longer version of what we just talked about, and had some really great conversation and dialogue with the audience about that.
Fantastic. Well, Kevin, we're at the end of the show here, but thank you so much. It's been a very enlightening conversation. Appreciate you taking a time out of your busy day to share your knowledge with us here.
Well, thanks, Manoj, for having me. It was great to be a part of this podcast. Thank you.